So, is sex binary or is it a spectrum? Well, I think it helps to first define what a spectrum is. A spectrum is a set of values spread across a continuum where the endpoints of that continuum are polar opposites from each other. But the values across that continuum may not be all that dissimilar from the value adjacent to it. Hopefully that makes sense. I think most people know what binary is. It means just two values. So I've been, reading more about these discussions and hearing what other people have to say. And there are lots of arguments on both sides. So I want to present my opinion on whether or not I think it is binary or whether or not it's a spectrum. But first, the thing I want to address is whether or not um, certain physical abnormalities can still be considered part of a spectrum. So, the main argument for why people believe sex to be a spectrum is because of intersex conditions. However, some people say that those intersex conditions do not count because they are abnormalities. So I thought about that. I performed a thought experiment. Can you describe a human physical trait as a spectrum that also includes abnormalities? And the answer to that is yes, you can. So up here you see I have written hearing. So I'm going to draw a spectrograph for the range of human hearing that people possess. A spectrograph in scientific parlance means a tool to measure light, but in this context, I'm going to use it to describe these pictures that I'm going to draw. Okay, so let's begin drawing what might be a spectrograph for human hearing. So over on the left, I'm going to draw this tiny little circle here, and then I'm just going to kind of continue onward. Okay, this is not going to be perfect. Don't expect this to look perfect. In fact, this one should probably be shifted downwards. Let me just start that over again right here. Okay, this is a little bit better. That's actually a little bit too big. I think you kind of get what I'm going for, though, you know. Oops. Off to a flying start, I would say. Off to a flying start. So here we are. So in the middle here, this represents the range of hearing that most people possess. Okay, so you can kind of tell that the size of the bubbles that I'm drawing here represent how many people are represented at these ranges. Just that's not great, but there we go. So let me write here. This over here, okay, this over here represents deaf. Deafness is an abnormality. Okay, this over here, however, represents perfect hearing. Just write P hearing. Okay, so the group on the far left is, wait a minute, got cut off a little bit here. Okay. The group on the far left of my spectrograph represents people, the population of people in the entire human population that are deaf. And then the bubble on the far right, all the way over here, represents people with the best hearing in the world. So you can see that even in this spectrograph, um, we have people represented with a abnormality. Being deaf is not normal. It is in fact an abnormality, whether they were born with it or they gradually lost their sense of hearing as they got older, or an accident happened that caused them to become deaf. And you have a range of hearing values in between the two. And the bubbles that are the biggest represent the majority of people in the world. So you can see that the the greatest representation is in the middle, while the extremes represent a minority, both in perfect hearing and also deafness. But you can see that deafness and abnormality can be represented on a spectrum to describe a human physical trait. Okay, so the point of this is just to illustrate that yes, even abnormalities can be represented in a spectrograph and can be described as a spectrum. Now, can we do that with sex? Is the question. And that's the question everyone is asking about. Well, let's see. What would that look like? If we were to draw a spectrograph of human sex, what would that look like? Well, you'd have a bubble over here that's really big, right? And then you'd have a bubble over here that's also really big. And I'm going to label this as male. 1 second. So I'll just call this male. I'm going to call this female. With me so far? This is not too complicated, I hope. Let me just shift this down a little bit. All right, so then what's in the middle? In the middle, you get a whole bunch of dots. In fact, this is actually not really the best way to describe it. Really, it's actually just fewer dots. I would say let's put it over here, maybe like that. And there you have it. And then I'm going to do this. And I'm going to call this intersex. Now, the thing is, now we satisfied the criteria that even though intersex conditions may in fact represent physical abnormalities, for example, chromosomal abnormalities or hormonal abnormalities, you can still represent it in a spectrograph, but you can see that this is a very tiny percentage of the population. In fact, this represents less than 1% of the entire human population. Intersex conditions represents less than 1% of the entire human population. And to confound things, intersex is not a monolithic thing. Intersex describes a variety of different conditions. Some of them can include chromosomal abnormalities, but there are various different kinds of chromosomal abnormalities. There are also hormonal abnormalities. There are also birth defects. There's lots and lots of different conditions that can give rise to intersex. But even so, there are still lots of people represented in both the male category and the female category that have a lot of conditions that would be included in intersex, but they are still considered either male or female. Okay? So you kind of see the problem here, right? Look at how different these two spectrographs look. So on one hand, you have hearing, where the majority of people are represented in the middle, and the extremes are the minority, the tiny, tiny minority. Whereas for sex, the vast majority of people are represented at the polar opposites, whereas the continuum in between those two endpoints is minuscule. So, what is correct? What is the correct way of describing sex? Is it correct to describe it as a binary, or is it correct to describe it as a spectrum? And here's the thing that's going to drive everyone crazy. There is no real correct objective answer. And the reason is very simple, because what we call sex and how we describe it, you got to understand what is the point in creating labels for these things and creating categories. These categories do not actually exist in reality. Things in reality are what they are, and they're not what they're not. Okay, what we call them, the labels that we apply to them, are simply mental constructs to help human beings understand the universe around them and to communicate that information to other people to help them understand it. Okay, so this is a human thing that we're dealing with. And that's why there's so much controversy over this issue and why no one can ever agree. Because while we can say objectively, yes, there is male and there's female and then there are intersex conditions, those are objective facts. But how we describe them and how we communicate that information, that's on us. So the question I pose is, what is the most helpful way of teaching people about sex? Is it as a binary or is it as a spectrum? And honestly, there is no right answer to that. Okay, that's up to you. That's your opinion. Okay. Um, I will say that in the case of describing sex as a spectrum, it does appear to overemphasize the intersex conditions, which are, by the way, not a monolithic thing. Unlike male or female, this represents a wide variety of different conditions, and they're all disorders. So I won't give you a bad answer here. I will give my opinion. In my opinion, and I want to stress this is just my opinion, and you can disagree, and no one's really right or wrong on this. It's not really helpful to describe sex as a spectrum because it emphasizes, it puts the focus on intersex conditions. And in the vast majority of studying about biology and stuff like that, that's not really all that helpful. Um, Now, it is, however, helpful when trying to understand intersexuality. It is very um, helpful in understanding intersexuality. I think it might be helpful in understanding transgenderism. However, transgenderism is not the same thing as intersex. Okay. So you have to kind of proceed with caution there because people like a lot of people who identify as trans um, do fall into a binary of male or female the vast majority of time. Um, so yeah, even when they identify as non-binary or gender fluid, they overwhelmingly are represented as either male or female as their biological sex. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I might make more videos on this subject. We shall see. All right, that's it. See you guys later.